Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Chrysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey everybody, I'm so excited to be welcoming Emily Wilkins to the podcast. Emily has more than 15 years of experience helping job shops market themselves by giving them the tools and confidence they need to crush it. Emily is the founder and president of Marketing Metal, the anti-agency that helps small manufacturers become magnetic to the humans they need to thrive and create real positive impact in their communities. Emily speaks at industry conferences and on podcasts about the magic that happens when job shops have a killer brand they're proud to shout out. Emily, thanks for coming on the Everyday Business Problems Podcast.
Thank you for having me, David. Super
excited. I know. I am excited as well. I didn't mean to cut you off there, but I'm just so thrilled to be talking about marketing automation with you. I think that this is an area, like many areas throughout businesses, especially in the manufacturing and distribution spaces, that we have this thought process that technology often solves all of our problems. And the reality of that, as we both know, is that that is not quite the case. So I want to take a deep dive today into marketing automation, talking about what is technology's role in marketing automation and kind of in your experiences as general. So I'll leave it there to kind of kick things off. I'd love to hear from you on where you land with this.
Yeah. Basically, if you haven't done the work yet, you're not ready for marketing automation. You have to do the work first. You have to really develop your content, your ideas, and there's AI tools and automation tools that can help with that. But really, it starts with, what do you want to put out there into the world? What is your company great at? Who do you want to target specifically? Get super specific on who you want to target, and get to the core of what they're, what they're struggling with. And like we were talking about before, you really have to get into those pain points and speak to those pain points and show that you have a solution for them through your content.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with where your head is at on all of that. And at what point do you think that kind of technology took that over? Because I talk a lot about business systems, and when most people hear business systems, right, the first thing they think about is technology. And that's where I kind of started the conversation in terms of people in general thinking kind of technology is the answer. At what point do you feel like that kind of took over and that we left, the planning people process in the dust and just started to go focused on technology?
In the marketing world, I think it was like the rise of HubSpot, because seriously, their sales team, they just make you think that all your problems will be solved if you sign up for, if you spend thousands of dollars a year on HubSpot, then, it'll all be done for you. You don't have to do anything. That's not true at all. That was when I started noticing it, but I'm sure it goes back, long way before that. And technology's come a long way, right? It does do more for us now than it used to, and it has some AI things that can help help get the ball rolling for you. I think sometimes like using copy AI. I don't know if that's something you've done before, just to get started with a blog post, because a lot of the time staring at a blank page is always so much harder than when you have something to start with. But to me, it still doesn't help me any differently than what I did before, because what I did before was just go out on the internet and find an article that is similar to what I want to say and then put my own spin on it. and like go through and kind of change it all to sound like me and to sound like what I really want to say. So it's not that much different than having a computer generate that copy for me. I'm just finding it in a different place. So I don't know.
Yeah. No, no, I agree with you. What's really interesting, one of the things I was thinking about as you were talking, and I agree with you on kind of like the rise of the SaaS, tool platform, whatever, we want to call it. Right. But it's interesting. So what I was thinking about is, this kind of connectedness, if you will, from the standpoint of, the rise was probably as those platforms were being developed, but the whole reason people are thinking that it's the answer is because of marketing, because marketing is doing such a great job of nailing the pain point of what you're experiencing and tying that to the solution, right? Their solution, which in most cases happens to be some sort of a SaaS, product platform, right? What's your take on that?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, and we were talking before we started, like, it's always about the work. You have to do the work. If you don't do the work, then you're not going to be able to streamline and make things more efficient. Like, you have to do the work first, and then once you get your process down and you figure out, where all the holes are and what, where your strengths are, right? Where are you most valuable and effective? Once you nail all of that down, then you can start to say, okay, I really hate this piece of it. Like, how can I outsource this or get it done faster, quicker, better, whatever. This piece is really taking up a lot of my time. Like, let's figure out how to, maybe there's a SaaS solution out there that can help me with that. So yeah, doing the work.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, there is really no secret for doing the work, but to your point earlier, I got to imagine that you've been into multiple facilities, multiple businesses that have some sort of CRM implemented, right? Whether it's HubSpot or fill in the blank. And you probably, I'm imagining, hear pushback from people on the team that are like, there's never any accurate information in there. It's too cumbersome to go through and, add information. You probably hear from leadership, I'm imagining, nobody ever wants to use the CRM, even though we've, paid all this money for it, and so on and so forth. And I think the point really behind all of that is what you were saying in terms of, technology is great to automate the parts of the process that need to be automated, whether from an efficiency and utilization standpoint, a waste reduction. But if we don't understand what we're doing before we automate it, then, you kind of have this constant back and forth, right? Of, well, what came first,
Right.
like,
Yeah.
so in that scenario, how do you help businesses kind of unpack that and unwind that? How do you get back to those basics of like setting up that strategy and what do those processes look like while people are, still in one of these tools, if you will, this technology that they're kind of being forced to use? What's your kind of go-to approach in a situation like that?
Getting people to actually use a CRM. that is it's a tall order. It's like more than actually implementing the CRM. I don't know. Leadership is a huge part of it. Like your leadership really has to embrace it and make it, show that it's important or talk about the importance of it and have a weekly check-in on it. Like, what did you are you struggling with something specific with this system, or are you just forgetting to do it? Like, can we put some reminders in your phone to make you remember to do it? Or, there are 100 different ways, but I think it really has to be like the leadership really has to have buy-in and get their team to buy in on what you're doing. And I think, showing the benefits and really painting the picture of what what you're hoping to do long term with this thing. I think that always helps, right? Like, this is going to make your job a lot easier. Like, Joe Schmo is really good at talking to people. So if, but he's not great at technology. So, just getting him to realize that he'll be able to spend more time talking to people and closing deals if he just spends 2 minutes after each call, like putting in putting in some notes, or maybe we can show him how to use a talk to text so that he's not having to type it with his thumbs. Like,
Yeah.
it's, just little things like that are like, what is really holding you back from using this thing, and how can we?
Yeah, those are all really great suggestions, and it kind of goes back to having some fundamentals from a documented process standpoint in place, and getting to what is really, to kind of use your word, like what's slowing the person down, what's slowing the department down, what are those roadblocks?
Why are you struggling?
Yeah,
why is
yeah,
that
exactly.
Why is that what's holding you back? Why, right?
Yeah, 1,000%. And and it doesn't, one of the other things that I kind of tell people is that it doesn't necessarily have to be ultra formalized, right? Like, sure, you could do a deep dive root cause analysis, but you can also just ask people, like, why are we struggling with this thing, when it kind of comes back to that automation piece, and how all of that fits into the processes that we're trying to execute. And again, another thing that you said in there that I 1000% agree on, and it's kind of a hard lesson I learned personally in my years of leadership, but it is that thought process of having to share the kind of the why and the what well before the how. So, we started this conversation talking about marketing automation and the technology piece. So in a lot of cases, we've already defined the how, right? But we're just now starting to talk about the why and the what. And, the why being, what are, kind of why behind this particular change? Like, what are those things that we're trying to drive? And that's how I look at the why. How I look at the what is kind of, what's the impact on the people, right? So kind of in your point, what's the impact for people of, what's the feeling going to be? You're just asking me to do more work. Okay, well, that's not the case, but we do need this information, and here's why we need this information. So again, what can we do to, accomplish both of those things, where you're not thinking, we're just requiring this for no reason, we're not going to use the information, all of those types of things. So that's really good information there. So kind of shifting gears, but in the same vein, when it comes to the marketing automation piece, we've talked about some of the pain points and struggles that we see. Like, on the opposite side of that, what are some of the things that you've seen in your experience kind of as the advantage to looking at, once you've got the planning people process in place and you understand that functionality of what's happening, what are some of the advantages of aligning the appropriate technology or automation piece with, the planning people process piece?
Removing redundancies, helping people focus on what they're really good at, and doing less of that busy work. Cost can be a thing. If your top sales guy is spending half his week, processing paperwork or whatever like that, you need to rethink that and figure out a cheaper, quicker, more efficient way to do it, right? So yeah, cost, your team's culture, whatever, your team's like level of happiness, what's the word I'm looking for?
Yeah, it's kind of that, that culture, that engagement piece where, people look at as you from a leadership perspective to removing those roadblocks, like I said, and not feeling like, well, Tim said that we've got to use this, particular CRM or what, fill in the blank, right? So I guess we have to, instead of looking at it from the standpoint of, how do you identify and ultimately remove those roadblocks for people that are in your team, on your team, in your organization.
Yeah, I'm constantly asking my team, like, what are you doing right now in your day to day that you feel like you are not good at or just hate doing? Like, what's on your to-do list all the time that you never get to? Tell me those things so that we can figure out other solutions for them, because I want them to be doing what they're best at always.
Yeah.
And same with me. I want to be doing what I'm best at always.
Yeah.
And, like we just talked about, being a business owner, that's not always easy to do in the beginning, early stages when you're building. But eventually I'd like to be able to take a lot of things off my plate. And I definitely have lists of those things, I am documenting every single one of them. Like, okay,
yeah,
as soon as I can hire a VA, I'm getting this off my list to this one and this one,
Yeah, it's twofold. It's interesting because, on one hand, you have some business owners, kind of people that have grown up into like an operations leadership role that have a really hard time of letting go. Right. Yeah. So you've got that kind of on one side, and on the other side, you have others that are really good at letting go, but not really great at kind of building the system around that letting go. So it's interesting. And I totally agree. It's kind of a matter of identifying that's kind of where I was going, right? Like, you have to kind of understand, who am I, right, as a business owner, as an operations leader, and then you can start to kind of unpack the rest of that to build that infrastructure around what you're trying to do. Right. And, all of it comes back to mindset, right? And being open to this thought process of like, hey, I don't have all the answers, even though maybe, like I'm sure you've met plenty of business owners who grew their manufacturing business from, literally nothing, that, a one person machine shop to whatever it is today, 10, $50 million, real business. But sometimes for people like that, they have a real hard time of, letting go and recognizing, hey, that there's other really talented people out here. So, those are kind of, I feel like, all fit into this conversation around not just the marketing automation piece, but really, at a greater level of understanding how to put the that infrastructure in place, that planning people process part in place, and then being able to layer in, the technology, the automation, the marketing automation, the operations automation, all of those things.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I'm so guilty of that, of being that super controlling, like, cause I have a super high bar for myself, and I want to make sure that my customers are getting exactly what we promised, and I want to make sure that they're happy with what we're providing and that it's working. And so it's hard for me to let stuff go, because when I let it go and it doesn't get done the right way, then I'm frustrated, and I don't want to be frustrated with my team. I want to I want to lift them up, right? But on the other side of it, it all falls back on me, because if they're not doing it right, that means that I didn't train them correctly, and I didn't give them all the right tools and time and resources to make sure that they can do it correctly. So it's this whole thing, like chicken before the egg thing. Like, you have to do the work yourself first and define what those processes are and really document. And I do like screen recordings for anytime I want to offload something that I've been doing. I will do a screen recording of it. Like, you use Loom, right?
Yeah.
Just do a Loom where you're explaining, okay, this is why I do this is why I do this is why I do this. You have to do it this particular way. And and I'm really particular about these 3 things, or whatever, like getting really detailed on how you want to see it done, and then and then reviewing with them together, making sure that they're understanding it, and executing it correctly. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, it makes a huge difference, and the other thing that I would kind of add into that for people that are listening out there is, you know, it's always a challenge. I've personally always kind of found it a challenge, right? But it's things that you grow into throughout your leadership journey. But what I've come to realize through a lot of poor decisions in my own leadership journey is that to kind of, and there's a quote around it. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's this idea of bringing other people into the mix, right? And so I tell the story when I was, a young operations leader. I kind of thought like, oh, well, I can do it all, right? I can see the problem, I can ideate the solution, I can implement the solution, and everybody will just be so thankful that Dave created this whole big solution to the problem. And so what there is much more power in, and what I realized finally is that bringing people together, having the framework, if you will, but then letting people bring their own talents and ideas to what that process is, and then developing the tech on top of that to automate some of what we had talked about, like what are those key points that are kind of slowing you down or feeling like they're just redundant steps in it that we can just totally automate, get it out of the way. So there's so much power into that, whether we're talking about, small business, solopreneur, 5-person team, up to enterprise level companies where you've got operations leaders that have, a team of 15, 30, 50 people they're responsible for and still trying to drive progress forward, right? There's process improvement that can happen. That can happen, though, when you bring people along for that journey and you start talking about the problems you're seeing from, the viewpoint that you have, because you have a different viewpoint than what somebody on the team is going to have. So you talk about those problems you're seeing from your viewpoint, and then you start to say, are you seeing things like this at your viewpoint? And how do those two things connect to each other, to ultimately get to the point that we're actually problem solving, through planning people process and looking for the ways to automate down the road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
So, I love this conversation. I can literally talk about this stuff all day long. So let's talk about, some of the clients that you work with. You're working mostly with manufacturers, helping them with kind of strategy and execution around marketing, which is, how this all fits in terms of that marketing automation standpoint. I mean, are you seeing businesses out there? I guess my first question is kind of, when you're engaging with these folks, what are kind of those first few steps of looking at what they're currently doing from that automation standpoint and that process standpoint? And how are you kind of unpacking that to say, here's what we need to focus on? Like, here's how we understand what you're doing really well. So ultimately we can kind of take that stuff and, repurpose it from the planning people process, technology stage. I'd love to learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the first part of my process is always this. I call it the setup. It's basically just an interview with my client. I really deep dive into, what are the things that you're great at? What are you struggling with? Where do you want to be? What do you envision in next year at this time, in 5 years, in 10 years? What is kind of your long-term goal? What resources do you have at your disposal? All of those kinds of questions to really try and figure out what the best path forward is for them. I guess in terms of marketing automation, an example that comes to mind is a client that I worked with that they had signed up for the free HubSpot CRM, which is great, and they got their sales team using it, and it was, they had gotten their process down and they were doing quotes through it, and it was working out great for that. And then they wanted to do some email marketing through it, and they sent out their first email campaign, and like weren't getting, or their deliverability rate was low, so they weren't, the emails weren't actually getting to the inboxes of their clients, and they had really low like opens and clicks on the email. So they talked to the salespeople at HubSpot, and they were like, "Oh, that's because you're on the free plan, and if you upgrade to the $8,000 a year plan, then your emails will get delivered." And it's like, no, no, that's not how
Wow.
this works. You don't have to pay $8,000 a year to make sure that your emails get delivered. So,
Wow.
yeah, so it's finding things like that where I'm like, no, like, no. Um, Finding better solutions, and a lot of that is just research. I'm always researching new SaaS and different technologies and things, and trying to figure out which one works, and they're always evolving and getting better. And then
Yeah.
you're using one because it does all these things, and then you find another one that does all these things plus all these other things, and then you're like, oh, maybe we should switch over and do that. So it's
It's
like
the never,
it's
yeah.
always this thing that you're constantly chasing. But I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it did. I mean, it's interesting. A couple of things in there. I agree with you. It feels like it's always a moving target, and again,
Oh
that's
yeah.
why I go back to when we talk about systems, and it really doesn't matter the size organization that we're talking about. I'm very kind of critical from the standpoint of how I lay out how that system breaks down, because what I find is that, to your point of the SaaS platforms, and really, I mean, it's no different than like an enterprise software, right? Like you
Yeah.
can just as easily say the same thing about enterprise software, and that is, the majority of them function. If we're just looking at functionality, the majority of them function similarly. Now, you
Oh
might
yeah.
find one that has this feature over that feature, those types of things. But what's underneath that is that planning people process part. So, one of the things that I'm really curious about, though, like in your HubSpot example, is just from the standpoint of what did you end up kind of finding? Like, let's peel that back just a little bit, because I think it's really interesting, right? Like, you have two sides of that. You have obviously the sales side of, trying to increase revenue from, the SaaS product standpoint. But, two questions. One, did they upgrade? And if they did upgrade, did it actually improve the deliverability? Because to me, that's really interesting from a platform perspective. I have a guess as to what the answer is, but I'll stop there and I'll ask my other question in a minute.
So they did upgrade, and this was several months before I started working with them. Um, they did upgrade, and then they didn't end up doing any emails after that. So
Oh,
like, again, kind of putting the cart before the horse. Like, build all your email sequences out first, and then get the platform, because emails are hard. Like, it's hard to come up with this stuff. That's what takes the most time, is like coming up with the emails, and figuring out what to say, and figuring out what the next step in the sequence is going to be for that email. Or if you have a few different products or a few different services or whatever, different types of customers, like figuring out how to segment them, and come up with specific content that's just for them. Like, that's all, that all should happen before you spend $8,000 on an email platform. Like, because otherwise it's just going to sit there, for a year. So we did end up switching them back to the free CRM. They were already using it, and they liked it, and they had it going, so I wasn't going to touch that. So we switched them back to the free CRM, and we integrated it with a different email platform that has higher deliverability and is way cheaper than what they were using.
yeah.
So I really like MailerLite. If you've never heard of that, but it
I've not heard
has.
of that one, no. That doesn't mean anything, though, because there's so many,
No, I know. There's so
so
many.
many
There's so many
platforms.
out there. Oh my god, I've looked into so many different ones. But what I like about MailerLite is that it kind of does all the things, and at the low rate. Like, you can set up triggers and automations, and and all these different that you can put in, first name, last name into the emails, different things like that. Dynamic content is what they call it. And But the really cool thing about the deliverability is that you set it up with your domain so that the emails actually come from your email instead of like when you send something from MailChimp, which is one of those, that we used MailChimp for a really long time because it's cheap and easy.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
but when you send an email from MailChimp, it says from Emily Wilkins via MailChimp, blah, blah, blah. And then there's like the MailChimp email address that it comes from. So spam filters catch that more often, whereas if it's coming actually from your email address, then it won't get caught in your spam.
Yeah, I mean, so many people, complain about spam emails, and so the technology, we're talking about that, right? The technology has evolved and gotten smarter, which on one hand, great, less spam emails. On the other hand, when you're a, not a new manufacturer, let's say, but a manufacturer who is newly starting to get into email marketing and email automation, could be a real challenge for, that deliverability piece and actually reaching people that you want to reach to, drive conversations and ultimately conversions. So,
right. But that all comes back to the content.
Yeah.
And you have to come up with that content based on your knowledge and your expertise and what you think your customers are really going to connect with. Talk to your customers, like, what do you really appreciate about us, and coming up with those stories. Anytime you can be more specific with details and, I love like metaphors, people, one of my colleagues, one of my really good friends, Alexandria Trousseau, she has an incredible weekly email that I actually read because she's entertaining. Like, she has kind of a sassy tone to it sometimes, and she's she's always kind of relating it back to some other thing that is in her life. Like, I can't think of a good example right now, but just being really human and detailed, and that's when people are going to connect with what you're saying and really appreciate what you're saying. You have to find ways to be valuable so that they want to open your emails. I do have a couple of emails like Alexandra's that I like to open, and I feel like I get value out of it when I read it. So so it's being that.
That's awesome. I mean, I don't want to get too far off topic here, and we're getting ready to wind down, but maybe a future episode, because I think that all really great information that you shared. And I think one of the things that I hear, even though I'm not really in the marketing space, but what I do hear from the clients that I've worked with, specific to manufacturing distribution, is this thought process around like, yeah, we do a lot of kind of white paper, technical things like that. But when we're talking about marketing, it's like, nope, nobody's interested in seeing how, we build this thing, or we weld, or any of those things. And it's like, I got news for you. Like, that's the stuff that people really are interested in. And it's kind of, I equate it back to like, that show, Dirty Jobs with Mike Rowe, or How It's Made. It's fascinating for people that are outside of these industries to understand how things are built and how they come together, even the engineering part behind it, and the thought process, and how the drawings come together, and how that information moves from, customer order out to the floor to, delivered product. So maybe we can, reserve a little bit of that for a future show, but I think that'd be really meaningful for a lot of people to hear kind of your perspective on that content creation piece. And again, it goes back to how we started this, from a putting the work in before we look for ways to automate and build other things on top of it.
Yeah, and I agree. Like, white papers are boring. That's why people don't like to read them. So take your white paper and add a bunch of personality to it, and human factors, and emotion, and things that people actually connect with, and then put it out there and see what happens. Because I
Yeah,
bet you'll
and
get a
don't
lot more
call it a
traffic.
white paper. Like call it,
Yeah,
like call it a pink sheet or something. Like call it something fun because like. But how cool would that be to have a manufacturer that puts out like a white paper that has technical knowledge in it, but actually has personality? Like I think that would
yeah,
crush for so many businesses out there. And again, we think about it's this idea of social selling and connecting with people, but it is all social. It's still
it's all
building
social.
relationships kind of
Yep.
one conversation at a time. It just happens to be done in a digital environment through,
Yep.
you know, through written word and through visual and video and all of those things. But I think a lot of times when we think marketing, we immediately think then sales, and nobody wants to talk about sales.
Ads.
It's so it's all
Everyone
of
hates
those.
ads.
Yeah, right. It's all of those things. So it's like, how do I unsubscribe to this? How do I get out of this? But it's, to your point, it's when you make those connections, when you have personality, when you're uniquely you, and when you're not afraid
And
to
you're
show that. Yeah,
vulnerable, and you talk about
exactly.
things
Well, we
you
don't like to
struggle
talk
with,
about
things
that.
you've learned. I know.
Yeah, but that's what drives relationship. That's what makes me want to work with Emily over, the thousands and tens of thousands of other marketers out there. She's going to occasionally maybe drop the F bomb. She's going to know how to, talk shop when she's in a shop. Like it's all those things though, versus like I say, I still have a full closet full of suits. I hope I don't ever have to wear them again. It's not because I don't,
I know.
I can't have those conversations, but I enjoy being a little bit looser from time
Yeah.
to time. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. For sure.
Well, Emily, let's put this conversation on pause for now. Final thoughts on marketing automation, and I would love to have you back at some point to continue the conversation and get into some other topics. So, final thoughts on marketing automation.
Um, I mean, we didn't we didn't come up with robotics and the automated assembly line first, right? We came up with like people in one person in their shop filing away at something for hours and chiseling away at something for days on end. Like that all came first. So, and that's the same in your business. Like you have to cultivate that. Come up with that content on your own and put yourself in the head of your customers and really do that work of figuring out what what are they afraid of, what are they struggling with, what are they frustrated with, what in terms of not just how your solution, not just in terms of your solution, but in general, like get the bigger picture of the world. What's happening right now in the world. Like we have talent shortages and all of this stuff. Like how is what you're doing related to that? And really just coming up with these ideas and getting them down and leveraging you and your team's talents, right? If you like having conversations, then maybe you should start a podcast. If you think that you're a great writer, maybe a blog is better and an email. Different things like that. Just like you don't have to do all the things. You do whatever is, we can't all be David Chrysler.
Let's not get crazy, okay? Let's not get
Let's
crazy.
not get crazy here, okay? Start with one thing that you think you might be good at and really focus on it and spend the time building it out and document your process of how you're doing it and document what are some of the things that you would rather not spend your time on or and then try to find a solution for that.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. The one thing I would add to what you were saying in there, especially around the thought process of, that creating content piece and kind of letting that part speak out, right, is there's a tremendous kind of reservation, I feel like, from a lot of maybe business owners, operations leaders, to let their people on their team and throughout their organization kind of have their own personal brand that supports the company brand. But at the end of the day, that happens regardless of how much you support that, right? Because we all have conversations and lives outside of business, which means we're already sharing those stories with people that we know. So why wouldn't you want to encourage that and to give people on your team and throughout your organization tools and support to help them create their own brand, and ultimately helping you create, more kind of drive and, goodwill around your brand. So
100%. The only thing I would say is help them cultivate their brand, because we all have a personal brand already. Like, everyone has a personal brand, right?
Yeah.
We'll have our own smell.
No, I 1,000% agree with that. That's why I said you definitely need to help and to provide tools and structure and outline for a lot of those things. But I just felt like that was a good spot to kind of interject that. So, sure. Emily, thank you again for coming on the Everyday Business Problems podcast. Looking forward to another episode in the future.
Thank you for having me, David.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Chrysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Chrysler.